A group of analysts gathered here in Washington to discuss the Bush administration's foreign policy agenda, including its call for regime change in Iraq. This forum was hosted today by the New America Foundation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. My name is Steve Clemens, and I'm Executive Vice President of the New America Foundation. Today we are very honored to be co-sponsoring today's program with the World Policy Institute. I think that this will start, a very important relationship between our two organizations that begins to explore many of the relatively unexplored pathways of American foreign policy right now. I also want to thank the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for, on very short notice, helping us with this facility, because there's no way that we could have hosted all of you in our rather modest conference facilities. Some of you know the New America Foundation organizes brown bag lunch programs all the time. And I love to create very crowded events where you are forced to mingle with one another a lot more than you might have expected. But today this seemed more appropriate to have all of us here at the Carnegie Endowment. So I'd like to thank the staff. Before I introduce the panel of speakers that's speaking today on the topic American Grand Strategy Beyond the Bush Doctrine, I'd like to ask the director of the World Policy Institute, Stephen Schlesinger, to say a few words. Steve?
Thank you very much. We are delighted to co-host this event. This is the first event we've done in Washington, and we hope there will be many in the future. We have some connections to the New America Foundation. Ted Halstead, who's now president, was a senior fellow at our institute and actually conceived of the idea of the New America Foundation, went with us, and then went on to Washington to set it up and establish it as a thriving institution. And Cheryl Sweninger, who's on this panel, is one of our senior fellows at the institute. We are a research institute at the New School University in New York. We have a former Washingtonian who's now president of our university, former Nebraska Senator Bob Kerrey. We publish a quarterly magazine called the World Policy Journal. We have 25 senior fellows, among them Cheryl, sitting here, who are working on various aspects of foreign policy. And we also put on our own panel discussions and lectures throughout the academic year in New York City. Our newsletter is sitting on a table outside. If you have a chance to see it, it gives a fuller description of exactly what our organization is all about. In any event, I'm delighted that we can do this today, and I hope we will be doing more in the future with the New America Foundation. And now I will turn the program over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We have a very distinguished panel of commentators today on this subject. And part of the reason why we decided to organize a program entitled really Beyond the Bush Doctrine and Think About Grand Strategy is that, regrettably, one of the characteristics of Washington that the New America Foundation was in fact sort of designed to try to respond to is that frequently you see a major gap in thinking in Washington with the rest of the country. You also see sometimes institutional paralysis around ideas. It can be from everything from Social Security and immigration policy to questions of foreign policy today. And on a major basis, it seems to some of us that the kinds of dynamic thinking and debate that ought to surround important foreign policy decisions leaves a bit to be desired. If you read the press, certainly there is a panoply of perspectives and a debate that does go on, but not to the degree that we think is appropriate. And we also feel that, from an institutional point of view, the Washington, D.C. think tank community, despite the billions of dollars that pumps through us, hasn't really provided a set of coherent alternatives of thinking. And so today, we're going to take a stab at providing some alternative views. Let me first say a few words about Charlie Kupchan, who is a senior fellow on the Council on Foreign Relations and also a professor at Georgetown University. I think I may be the first in mass media today, I'd like to greet all of our C-SPAN staff, to show Charlie's hot-off-the-press new book that I find absolutely remarkable from a perspective of someone who's been involved with the Council on Foreign Relations for some years, to see a book titled The End of the American Era, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Geopolitics of the 21st Century. The Council on Foreign Relations, in my view, despite being a terrific organization, nonetheless doesn't play the contrarian card very often. And Charlie Kupchan's book certainly goes against the grain, cuts against the grain of a lot of the rather triumphalist thinking about American foreign policy in the world today. It's a great pleasure to have Charles Kupchan with us. Michael Lind is director of the American Strategy Project of the New America Foundation, is a very distinguished author and writer. He is the only one I know who has written important collections in sort of on foreign policy. He's also written a novel. He's also written an epic poem. But he's one of the most prolific and important public policy intellectuals in the United States today. And he will soon have another book coming out that he may like to share with you as well. The American Strategy Project is designed to do what I said that New America Foundation is trying to do with this project today, is to put out material and to highlight alternative thinking than what we see in Washington right now about preserving and maintaining and directing American interests in the world. Anatol Levin is Senior Fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also a very distinguished public policy intellectual who has just a stunningly good article in this last issue of the London Review of Books, which manages to discuss oil politics in this country, as well as the Likud, all within a context of American domestic policy that he says he just crunches all together. But it's a very, very interesting and important and provocative piece that he may allude to in his comments, but I highly recommend that those of you to get on the web and look at his article on the London Review of Books. Cheryl Schweninger, as Steve Schlesinger indicated, is a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute. He's also co-director at the New America Foundation of the Global Economic Policy Program. Cheryl was the founder of the World Policy Journal and has done extraordinary and important work on the subject of the nexus of grand strategy and the economic dimensions of national interest in the world. And I think he'll have important thoughts on that issue. So without further ado, let me invite Charles Kupchan to take the podium. Our speakers will be speaking at the podium. We will follow with a discussion with all of you after that. Charlie Kupchan.
Thanks very much, Steve, for the kind introduction. I know that there are at least two people that are happy with that. It's my mother and my publisher, so we're off to a good start. I want to touch on four issues this afternoon. One is the approach to preeminence and dominance that is articulated in the Bush National Security Strategy. Second, say a few things about the use of force, that is, how power is wielded by this administration. Third, to talk a little bit about the domestic landscape in the United States and how I think that is shaping the Bush National Strategy. And then end with a few thoughts on the hot topic of the day, that is, Iraq and the battle against terrorism. So let me begin with the doctrine of preeminence, which I think is the most striking and in some ways alarming aspects of the Bush National Security Strategy. The document, and I think the administration in terms of its thinking, takes to a new level the notion of military superiority in the sense that there are many times in history, in our own history, in which the U.S. has set out to maintain a level of military superiority which will allow it to push back any potential challenger and to ensure that no hostile power emerge in Asia or Europe, the two main industrialized parts of the world that could challenge the United States. But what we've seen now is the articulation of a doctrine that says not only will we have enough power to overwhelm, to keep at bay any challenger, but we will be so strong that we will prevent anyone from even thinking about building up military force because we're going to be so far ahead that no one can catch us. So it's really a strategy of dissuasion, almost preemptive dissuasion, rather than superiority. And I think it's very worrisome for the following reason. That is that a country that maintains that much military power doesn't do what it says the Bush administration wants to do in other parts of the security strategy, and that is reassure, build cooperation with main centers of power, with main allies. And that's because a country that is so powerful, an international system that is so out of balance of its own course by nature, scares others because it suggests that there is no constraint, that the United States can do as it will and not play along, not go according to the rules of cooperation and coordination with other powers. So in that sense, I think it's a statement of an America that will have too much power, and as a result will invite the countervailing coalition that the United States is trying to avoid forming. The other problem I have with the preeminence doctrine is that it overestimates the importance of military power alone and underestimates the extent to which the international system also beats according to other sorts of power, other sorts of sources of order. I think that even if the U.S. does maintain unparalleled military power, which it will, that does not mean that the U.S. will always get its way. In fact, one can see in the international system today that we don't get our way. We're not getting our way in the UN. The EU went ahead without the United States on the Kyoto Protocol. The ICC, management of globalization, is another issue where military power doesn't get you as much influence as the Bush administration would seem to think. And yes, even in the fight against terrorism. In some ways, the most important asset in the fight against terrorism is cooperation with other powers. We need to have cooperation to freeze assets, for intelligence, for law enforcement. And so if we go out and pursue a doctrine of preeminence and in so doing undermine that cooperation, undermine those partnerships, we will in the end of the day imperil, not further, American security. We may get al-Qaeda, we may topple Saddam Hussein, but we will find ourselves, the United States, in a very lonely world in doing so. Final point, I think that a country that aspires to the level of preeminence and superiority that the United States has to be extremely concerned about how it uses that power. It has to exercise self-restraint. It has to practice compromise. It has to make sure that its power reassures and does not scare others. And that brings me to the second point, and that is the use of power. I think that the view of the world that is articulated, at least by the neoconservative wing within the Republican Party, has the following understanding of the use of power in international politics, and that is that power and the unabashed use of unilateral power is a source of order. Self-restraint and compromise will only invite people to challenge the United States. And in that sense, the Bush people see unilateralism as an asset, and they think that if we lead strongly, others will get behind us rather than balance against us. And that may be true in the imperial age, when brute force and the unadorned use of power was legitimate, but I don't believe it's true in the modern age, when neo-imperial policy, unadorned use of power, is no longer legitimate. So I think what's happening today is the United States is little by little losing the legitimacy of its power. And in some ways, that's its most prized asset, because we lose the deference, we lose the respect, we lose being a role model for the world, and instead our power is seen as a source of fear, as a source of disorder. So I think that precisely because the United States is as powerful as it is, it must be vitally concerned about self-restraint, compromise, institutions, investing in a consensual order. Final point, I think the U.S. overestimates the extent to which it is omnipotent, overestimates the extent to which it can run the world alone, and I would only point to the European Union as an alternative center of power that is day by day increasingly holding its own against the United States, making it increasingly difficult to get its way in international fora. Briefly on the domestic sources of the Bush national security doctrine. I think what we're seeing today is a world that is out of balance, both geopolitically and politically. It's out of balance in the sense that the U.S. has too much power for its own good and is therefore unrestrained. And it's out of balance domestically because a small group of people in the Bush administration have, in my mind, too much power. And that's because the centrist wing of the Republican Party, the liberal internationalists, Father Bush, Scowcroft, Henry Kissinger, they have really been pushed to the margins, and you're left with two extreme wings, the neoconservative wing and the traditional conservative wing, and they ought not to get along on foreign policy. Indeed, they didn't for the first year of the Bush administration. The neoconservatives were one day pressing unilateralism, and the traditional conservatives pushing neo-isolationism, get out of the Balkans, focus on Mexico, and every day it was back and forth and back and forth. What happened after September 11 is the constraining wing, the traditional conservative wing, had its legs cut off. And that has essentially left the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party in control. The one check on them might be the Democratic Party, but in the wake of September 11, the Democratic Party has essentially folded its tent on foreign policy and is really putting up no serious fight to the Bush administration on critical questions of the use of power. I think that the danger here is not just an America that is extremist in its striving for preeminence and abuse of power, but also one that risks a domestic backlash. Because I don't think that the U.S. People are going to support the sorts of neo-imperial policies that the Bush administration seems to be pursuing. And I think we ought to watch carefully what happened to Woodrow Wilson when he overreached with the American public and the Senate. And that is a precipitous backlash away from internationalism toward isolationism. Final point, terrorism in Iraq. I think that the Bush team has done a reasonably good job on a tactical level. That is the fight against al-Qaeda, trying to increase, enhance law enforcement, police cooperation, freezing assets. But that at the broader level, the strategic level, it has done a much poorer job. And that's because I think the Bush administration has essentially recast the world, has a view of the world in which terrorism is the defining element and the battle against terrorism the defining cause, and is therefore failing to focus on the traditional agenda, alliances, partnership, institutions managing the international order. And in that sense, I think the Bush administration is moving off with a view of the world that the rest of the world doesn't buy into. And that is one of the main sources of the increasing divergence between American policymakers and those in the rest of the world. As far as Iraq is concerned, I think that, again, the problem is not one of should we do nothing or should we do too much, but it is overfiring, that the Bush administration is right to be concerned about Saddam Hussein. But I think, in my mind, the nature of the threat does not warrant a full-scale invasion, nor does it warrant American occupation of Iraq, which strikes me as something that the United States does not want to get involved in if one thinks about the problem of keeping the country together. What happened the last time a great power tried to occupy Iraq, Britain, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they got out quickly, chased out by terrorism and rebellion. And I think the comparison to Japan and Germany is a very misguided one, both in terms of the starting material. Iraq has no real middle class to speak of, deep ethnic divisions, none of the intellectual capital that helped build Japan and Germany up. And in that sense, I'd be happy to see Saddam Hussein go, but it seems to me that ought to be left to the people of Iraq and not to the would-be governor, American governor of Baghdad. So I think we ought to practice containment. I would support the use of force if necessary against particular targets, weapons of mass destruction, depots, military infrastructure, through air power. But I think it is bordering on crazy to invade the country and occupy Iraq, both because I think it will not work well and because I think that in the end of the day it will probably detract from the war on terrorism by fueling extremism in the Middle East and by alienating our partnerships in the rest of the world. Let me just end by saying that, as the title of my book suggests, The End of the American Era, I'm not optimistic that this moment of primacy is going to last long. I think it will not last long, in part because others will rise, but also because the United States is in the midst of alienating others and therefore distancing itself from its main partners. I think there are ways to reverse that, move toward making room for others, work more through institutions and partnerships. But I think that at the very most, we have to begin to have a national debate about these issues, about grand strategy. That's not really happening today after 9/11. And I applaud Steve and others in trying to get this country to begin to have that debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite Anatol Levin, Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Anatol.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. Yes, I don't really have very much to add to what Cliff has said when it comes to Bush administration policies today. I agree with every word, unfortunately, I must say. Perhaps I'll say a few words about how US policies at the moment are viewed from Europe, and about this split between Europe and the US, about which so much has been written. There's a British pop song of many years ago, which some of you may know, which goes, if I remember, now I'm a union man, amazed at what I am. To my amazement, I find that I've been classed among the radicals by many critics in the United States. I always thought I was a kind of eccentric conservative in European terms, and it is perhaps somewhat indicative of just how great this gulf is becoming, that many European conservatives with a sense of history should also be profoundly worried by some of the present tendencies of US policy. Worried particularly in the case of those who are in fact passionately committed to trying to maintain the idea of the West and trying to maintain a functioning Euro-Atlantic partnership. Now, one line that one has heard from people like my colleague Bob Kagan on the neoconservative side is that Europe has somehow become postmodern as a result of its history, that the European Union is a postmodern organization, whereas America, and therefore cannot, and also is not interested in, dealing with the very tough problems which exist beyond its borders elsewhere in the world. That is indeed one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, however, is that the European Union is explicitly and at its core a post-nationalist organization. The whole central intention of the European Union is to overcome those European nationalisms which in the century before 1945 tore the European continent apart. And on that score, I think at a gut level, one thing that many Europeans find both very worrying and very strange about America is the level of American nationalism. Worried because it recalls to them aspects of a darker European past. Strange because it creates an impression of the United States as in some ways an unsatisfied power, as a power which is still striving against aspects of the international order, which is seeking more power for itself, more rights for itself, which of course appears very strange to a European for whom the United States looks, despite the qualifications which Cliff has mentioned, like a power with a kind of global hegemony which no power in history has ever achieved. So that's why you hear these continual statements in public or in private from Europe, the lack of understanding, if you will, about the extent of American dissatisfaction, American worry, American fear even, about the state of the world. This European concern or criticism of American policy is reinforced by something which Cliff has touched on, which is the experience of the end of empire. From a European point of view, all the major European powers, West European powers with the exception of Germany, which had an even more disastrous but very particular history, went through a period of trying to hold on to certain parts of what we used to call the Third World by force of arms. And they learned over time that they just couldn't manage it, that their own populations would not tolerate the sacrifices necessary over time to maintain this kind of hegemony. Even when, you might say, objectively speaking, across much of Africa, for example, it would appear that it was actually in the interests, the objective interests, of the areas concerned to remain part of these empires. And that clearly underlies a European feeling that many present American strategies, or at least intentions, simply will not work. most notably in the case of Iraq, that the maintenance of a client state, if you will, let alone its successful democratization, in view of the obstacles that such a policy will meet, will simply not be sustained by the American people and will not be, in fact, implementable on the ground. In the case of Afghanistan, there are already, I think, very obvious reasons to fear that the present setup there, on which so much of the war against terrorism in the region depends, will also simply not be sustainable without a very much greater input of American money, American arms, and perhaps European money and arms as well. But certainly that this idea, I mean, as somebody at the State Department said to me a few months ago, that by 2004 we will have a legitimate, democratically elected Afghan government in place in Kabul, and then we're out of there, is simply a bizarre fantasy. You know, you cannot run the world that way. You certainly cannot win the war against terrorism that way. Now, another feature of America at the moment, which I think is of deep concern in Europe, is what might be called the Wilhelmine aspect of American policy. Now, by that I do not mean an obsession with silly hats and large boots. I don't mean actually a very strong level of militarism, certainly by historical standards. But what I think is very visible, and particularly under this administration, is immense difficulty in creating a hierarchy of national interests and policy priorities, and deciding what is important and making adjustments accordingly. Every nationalism, of course, draws its strength from a wide range of different forces, of motives, of tendencies. That is one reason why nationalism is such a powerful force. But of course, to be really effective as a force of sensible external policy, it has then ultimately to assimilate these to a rational and coherent national strategy. And one rather one aspect of this, as I've said, is the tendency to behave as an unsatisfied power, because you have so many different groups pushing their separate, often contradictory agendas in different parts of the world. But in the case of the difficulty of establishing a hierarchy of national interests, a rather striking case, I think, recently, has been policy towards the International Criminal Court. A case which also reflects this hubris, this belief in supreme and unchallengeable American power, which Clifford has touched on. Because, of course, given the other threats facing the United States in the war against terrorism, given the plan to launch a really major war with highly unpredictable consequences in the Middle East, it looks really extremely strange to have advanced this not even secondary, this tertiary issue right to the top of the agenda, and in a way which had an absolutely disastrous effect on domestic European politics, and particularly the politics of left-wing and liberal parties in Europe when it came to support for American positions. I don't know what kind of happened to the reports from American diplomats in Europe warning of the consequences of this, probably what has happened to so many reports over the years. Because if you look just at the British Labour Party, for example, I mean, there were a whole range of different issues which have contributed to undermining what was the tremendous sympathy and support in Britain for America after 9/11 and at the time of the Afghan war. But possibly the single most irritating thing, as far as the Labour Party was concerned, was America's line on the International Criminal Court, something which was felt by many Labour people in Britain as a direct challenge to their fundamental values in international affairs. The consequence, of course, has been to gravely weaken the position of Tony Blair within Britain. It made it even more important, even vital, for Tony Blair to extract from the Bush administration a promise really to try to go through the United Nations when it came to war with Iraq. Something which, of course, I favour anyway, but the administration certainly didn't, or the dominant forces in it. And what one sees here, as I've said, is an inability to decide on one goal and then structure other things accordingly. An inability to recognize in time that there was a strong possibility that America really would need the support of Britain, that America might have to go to the United Nations, if only because of the need for the support of various Arab states in order to launch a war with Iraq, and therefore that other strategies, other issues, should be downplayed or structured accordingly. And what this reflects, of course, is two things. One is the feeling that allies really don't matter, an attitude that we've seen reflected again and again in the media in comments about Europe, which, of course, as we've seen, has to a very considerable extent proved false in this case. You know, it had to be recognized in the end that a purely unilateral American campaign against Iraq would not necessarily even have been practicable on the ground in view of the need for bases and some kind of minimal support. And secondly, a very strange breakdown of the elementary political principle that what you do in one area with regard to other countries' interests will have repercussions in other areas. That, for example, as a German journalist said to me recently during a visit to Berlin, when it came to the German election campaign and the line, the anti-American line, or at least the anti-administration line taken by Schroeder, this German friend said to me, given the number of cards that the Bush administration had given to German critics of America, to the old anti-American feelings of the left, it would have been nothing short of extraordinary if a leading German politician or group had not picked up those cards and played them. And from that point of view, I think one must say that some of the attitudes of the present administration, or forces within it, because of course one must certainly not put forward the view that this is a monolithic body, but in terms of the way that they see the world, they think of themselves as tough realists. I mean, I think of myself as a realist. But I would say, you know, if one looks at this case in particular, they're not just not realists. They're not just unrealists. Some of their views of the world I would describe as positively surreal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anatole. Let me just say two other words about Michael Lind of the New America Foundation. Michael actually served as editor of the National Interest, which is sort of the journal of record, I suppose, both co-owned in some parts by both realists, but also the neoconservatives. Michael comes from a school of thought, and I think has some important insight into the neoconservative dominance within this administration. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, the first in New America's book series with basic books called Made in Texas, George W. Bush and the Southern Takeover of American Politics, which will be on the stands the beginning of December. Michael?
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to use my time here first to describe the Bush doctrine as accurately and fairly as I can, and then to raise some criticisms about it. The first thing that has to be said about what's come to be known as the Bush doctrine is that it's not really the Bush doctrine. It's very doubtful that George W. Bush paid much attention to these matters before he began running for president a few years ago. It really should be called the Wolfowitz doctrine. Paul Wolfowitz, the number 2 figure in George W. Bush's Defense Department, has emerged as the dominant mastermind in the foreign policy of this administration, having defeated Colin Powell and his rivals in the State Department. The circle of so-called neoconservatives around Paul Wolfowitz Wolfowitz, has a well-worked-out theory of post-Cold War American grand strategy, which dates back to the first Bush administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. Indeed, George W. Bush, to my knowledge, is the first president whose foreign policy was debated 10 years before he assumed office. Some of you may recall, in spring of 1992, Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, circulated a classified document entitled a Defense Planning Guidance, proposing what America's role in the world should be following the Cold War. This was drafted chiefly by Paul Wolfowitz, and it reflects his thinking. The United States should preserve its post-Cold War primacy by means of enormous and massive military spending, outspending all other powers combined, use the preemptive military force preemptively to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and downgrade alliances. All of this in the spring of 1992. According to this Wolfowitz drafted report of the first Bush administration, the United States, quote, must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. Now, what made this very controversial at the time was, among the potential competitors were Germany and Japan. So what Wolfowitz and those who signed on to his views in the first Bush administration were proposing was that Germany and Japan, and presumably France and Britain and other countries, should be weaker militarily than the United States in their own neighborhoods. Nobody wants Germany or Japan to become a global superpower and have fleets patrolling the Gulf of Mexico. But Wolfowitz and his allies proposed that the European powers, the Asian powers, both allies and potential competitors like China, would permanently be kept subordinate in their own backyards by the United States, which would cease to be a North American power primarily and become a permanent European, a permanent Asian, and a permanent Middle Eastern military power. Now, this report, when it was leaked to the press, created a firestorm of controversy in the spring and summer of 1992, and it was quickly repudiated by the leading figures in foreign policy in the first Bush administration, by Secretary of State James Baker, by Lawrence Eagleburger, and others. And it was roundly denounced by our allies, and most of us thought that this was the end of that. Paul Wolfowitz retired from politics when Bush was defeated. The elder Bush became the dean of SAIS, of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. And we thought the neoconservatives would publish this sort of stuff in their magazines, but, you know, this is sort of a minor sect which is fading away in American policy. And then thanks to the Electoral College and rural overrepresentation, and a little help from the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, suddenly Paul Wolfowitz and his allies were running U.S. foreign policy, taking many of us by surprise. But what did not surprise us was what has come to be known the Bush Doctrine, that is, the Wolfowitz Doctrine of American primacy. Now, what is the Wolfowitz Doctrine? And I think we should give it the name of its primary author, not of a figurehead president. The Wolfowitz Doctrine is often misdescribed as imperialism or unilateralism, often pejoratively, but it's a fairly well worked out, consistent theory of international relations. While I disagree with him, I think that Mr. Wolfowitz is a brilliant scholar and statesman of a kind on the level of Henry Kissinger or Dean Acheson or George Kennan. And so I think we have to treat this theory with some respect, even if we disagree with it. What the Wolfowitzian neoconservatives have discussed for the past decade, they've organized their discussion of American national security strategy around two threats. One is so-called peer competitors, a phrase which is used in military planning. The other is rogue states, another term of art. A peer competitor is another great power like China, or in theory, Japan, or perhaps Germany or France or Britain, if you agree with their view of the world, which potentially could become a rival to the United States within a strategic region like East Asia or Western Europe. There are no peer competitors in the Middle East because all of the states there, including the ones that are hostile to us, are simply too weak. They lack the military, industrial, scientific resources. In the 20th century, the peer competitors were Germany, first under the Kaiser, and then under Hitler, and then the Soviet Union. So the proposed method of dealing with the peer competitors is permanent U.S. occupation of their regions, in effect, or military domination, not actual territorial occupation, but that is the United States will be the leading European power for the foreseeable future. It will be the leading Asian military power for the foreseeable future. And indeed, Wolfowitz and his allies in this earlier iteration of this ideology back in the first Bush administration came up with the doctrine reassurance, which sort of has not been part of the debate in this second round, but it actually describes their view of the world. Reassurance means that the United States will police Europe and Asia so that the European and Asian nations, the potentially militarily powerful ones like Japan and Germany and China and France, can disarm and concentrate on making goods to sell to us and on having generous welfare states for their citizens. That way they won't be a threat to their neighbors or to the United States. So the United States essentially will offer a bargain to all potential great powers in the world, similar to the one that we offered to West Germany before the end of the Cold War in Japan during the Cold War, where they were semi-satellites of the United States. We say, look, we will patrol the Mediterranean, we will protect the borders of Europe, we will patrol the Western Pacific. So don't bother yourself with converting your economic and industrial might into weapons, because there's no need to. And if you remember the Godfather novel by Mario Puzo, Don Corleone at one point decided he was not going to sell drugs, but he would provide the security for all of the other mafias, that way preserving his primacy as a mafioso. So there's some precedent in certain kinds of realpolitik for this offer that the U.S. does not want the world to refuse, that we will look after European and East Asian security forever, and so you people just sort of concentrate on making your computers and writing social security checks to your workers and giving them 6-week vacations. Now, whether the American people will go along with having permanently reduced living standards and impoverished welfare and Social Security and Medicare spending in order to protect the citizens of East Asia and Western Europe for the next century remains to be seen. But that's the idea of reassurance, that the U.S. will not simply collaborate with our European and Asian allies in providing their own defense, but we will actually take it over. We will go to war on their behalf, if necessary, so that they don't need to raise any armies which down the road might be turned against us. Then there's the rogue state question. This has to do with non-proliferation, the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, by states whose economic industrial base really does not give them any right or any legitimate interest in doing so. In a way, the Soviet Union was the first rogue state in its latter years after its military-industrial base began to decline. And really all it was a broken-down third world country with thousands of nuclear weapons. And today, North Korea, Iran, Iraq are usually listed as rogue states. Often Libya and Syria are thrown in there. Now, the policy towards rogue states, which has been hinted at by President George W. Bush in his West Point speech and also in some recent national security documents, is preventive war. And of course, a few weeks ago when we were debating the Iraq resolution, people drew attention to the important distinction between preemptive war and preventive war. International law, going back to the Renaissance, says that preemptive war is legal. That is, if the Japanese fleet is steaming towards Pearl Harbor, the U.S. can sink it. If it's clear that this is an imminent attack. You don't have to wait for Pearl Harbor to be bombed to strike back. That's an imminent attack. The planes are in the air. Even the missile silos may be on opening up. Preventive war is saying this country might be a threat in 5 or 10 or 15 or 100 years, so let's wipe it out now while they're weak. And for obvious reasons, as long as there's been a modern multi-state system, this has violated the laws of both war and of diplomacy for an obvious reason, because you would have constant war. I mean, no state would be secure. The mere fact that it got more prosperous and built up its military a little bit would allow any neighbors that didn't like it to invade it. So this is a genuine threat to the world order of multiple sovereign states that we've had for several centuries, in a sense that preemptive war, that is attacking an imminent preventing an imminent military attack, is not a threat to the global system. So what are the alternatives I think this is an accurate description of the Wolfowitz/Bush doctrine. That is, the United States will prevent the formation of future competitors like Imperial or Nazi Germany or like the Soviet Union by permanently being the dominant military power in Europe or in Asia, or at least, as long as any of us is around. That's called reassurance. That's the antidote to the threat of peer competitors. At least one of the methods of dealing with rogue states, that is usually poor, often hostile and tyrannical countries that acquire weapons of mass destruction, is preventive war, like the preventive war that we're discussing in the case of Iraq. Unfortunately, I don't think that critics of this strategy have been sufficiently articulate in pointing out the alternatives. There's been too much talk about forums and venues. This should be settled by Congress. This should be settled by the United Nations. Instead of saying, well, what should the actual alternate strategy be? I'll conclude by bringing to mind the old statement, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The strategy the United States pursued in the 20th century was remarkably successful. It was costly, but it was less costly than the alternatives. The way we dealt with peer competitors, to use this phrase, like Imperial and Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, was to lead coalitions of other great powers, not just little weak satellite countries that were totally dependent on the United States, but great military powers in their own right, against first Germany in 2 world wars, and then against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And I'm afraid my former friends in the neoconservative movement tend to forget that the United States did not win World War I. The United States did not win World War II. The United States did not win the Cold War. Coalitions of alliances to which the United States belonged won all 3 of those global conflicts. The Cold War was not a 2-country struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union was bankrupted and brought to surrender by a coalition of the United States, our NATO allies, Japan, China, and a number of smaller countries. And you can say the same thing about the Axis powers in World War II. So the traditional 20th century American strategy for dealing with hostile peer competitors was to be a member of an alliance that had preponderant power, that had more power than the opposing alliance, whether it was the Sino-Soviet alliance or the Axis alliance. But this strategy did not require the United States to outspend every other potential great power in the world. Indeed, we could add allied great powers' military strength to our own. This saved us from bankruptcy and insolvency and failure in the 20th century, and I think it will in the 21st as well. As for rogue states, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose when countries like North Korea and Iraq and Iran and so on build up, try to acquire weapons of mass destruction? If I can pause for just a minute with a slight digression, which I think is necessary. There is a country in the Middle East that has weapons of mass destruction, according to all credible reports. It's Israel. Israel reportedly has between 200 and 400 nuclear weapons, and there are all sorts of reports, which serious intelligence and defense analysts believe, that Israel also has stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons. All of Israel's weapons of mass destruction are paid for indirectly by the American taxpayer, since most of our foreign aid goes to the state of Israel, and every dollar spent on Israel permits the Israeli government to divert resources to its program of weapons of mass destruction. Now, I think Israel ought to have nuclear weapons. It's in a condition of existential peril. It needs deterrence against its enemies. But I think that we need an open and above-board discussion of this. Because if you don't, then the United States is in the situation of looking as though we might be waging war in the Middle East in order to preserve Israel's monopoly of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Let me just read you the population statistics of the other countries that are supposedly rogue states in the Middle East. Iraq has more than 20 million people. Syria around 15, 16 million people. Iran has 65 million people. Now, Iran was invaded by Iraq, with U.S. backing of Iraq, I should say, in the 1980s, and lost vast numbers of its citizens. It seems to me if you're an Iranian, whether you're a theocrat or a good, a Persian Democrat, you would want nuclear weapons as a deterrent against Iraq. Forget about Israel and the United States, but some of your other neighbors. I don't understand any principle of world order by which Israel, with 5 million citizens, can have weapons of mass destruction, and no one will even talk about this in public for fear of violating a taboo, while a country of what will soon be 100 million people, Iran, that's how many Iranians are going to be in another generation, supposedly can't possess one nuclear weapon compared to Israel's hundreds of nuclear weapons. So that's one thing that I'd like to say about the rogue states. If we're going to prevent nuclear non-proliferation, we cannot make an exception for Israel and never talk about it. Either Israel has to come out as a full-fledged nuclear power, the way India and Pakistan, which used to have this ambiguous status, are, or the United States is going to look more and more like its purpose of its Middle Eastern policy is to wipe out any potential weapons of mass destruction on the program of Israel's enemies, while subsidizing and saying nothing about Israel's own weapons of mass destruction. Should preventive war be part of a system of containing non-proliferation? There may be some circumstances. In world affairs, you can never have hard and fast rules. There may be some circumstances in which this makes sense. I don't think the case has been made for Iraq. I know that if this were even done once, it would reduce the utility of this tactic in future conflicts for obvious reasons. And I'll close by pointing out the flaw in the idea of preventive wars. The neoconservatives often argue that if we have a preventive war against Iraq to shut down its weapons of mass destruction program, at that point, Syria and Iran will become afraid of us, and plus other potential rogue states, North Korea, and at that point they'll give up their programs and they'll negotiate with us. Well, I presume the general staffs and the militaries of these other rogue states are not idiots. I assume that they know at this moment how many U.S. troops there are in the field, where our fleets are, where our troops are deployed, and so on. They will know that when the U.S. occupies one country in a preventive war, all of the U.S. troops necessary to occupy that country must be subtracted from overall military forces. If we then occupy a second country for 5 or 10 years, the actual deployable U.S. force shrinks by a commensurate amount. So if you actually embarked on this strategy of multiple preventive wars, the U.S. would, ironically, paradoxically as it seems, get weaker and weaker. So the more countries that we preemptively invaded or preventively invaded and occupied, the less afraid of us the remaining rogue states would be. So as one of my colleagues said earlier, the Wolfowitz doctrine, or the Wolfowitz-Bush doctrine, is often presented as an example of cold, calculating realism. In fact, I think it's somewhat visionary and optimistic. Genuine realists are much more aware of the limits of American power and much more skeptical about the ability of the United States to project it. Thank you.
And finally, let me invite Cheryl Schweninger from both World Policy Institute and New America Foundation, who recently, with Walter Russell Mead, published an important work called A Financial Architecture for Global Middle Class Development. Cheryl?
Thank you. Mike reminds us appropriately that perhaps we should call the doctrine the Wolfowitz doctrine. And that recalls, to my mind, an old adage that success has many parents. Failure has none. Failure is an orphan. So I guess my proposal for the name of this doctrine would be the no-name doctrine, because I think it is destined to fail. Now, there has been a lot of easy talk about American empire and hegemony the last 3 to 5 years, particularly after the Bush administration. And I think that is the wrong place to begin. You're all familiar with the litany. It begins with how the United States spends more on its military than the 12 to 15 next competitors, depending how you measure it. And it ends up by talking about how the U.S. is more powerful than the Rome was during the Roman Empire, or the British were during the British Empire. Now, I think if you begin by focusing on the supposed American preeminence, and to the point where you codify it in your principal national security strategy, you're going to end up at the wrong place with a mistaken grand strategy. Because I think what's more striking to me is the weaknesses of the United States in relationship to the principal challenges that the United States will face over the next decade or two. My notion of the proper measure of America's position in the world is in a sense the influence to be able to shape a world favorable to American interests and values, but also to do it in a way that doesn't require the continued exertion of more and more American resources and deployment of American power. In other words, you want a world that is in some ways sustainable and self-replicating. That used to be known as the term was solvency. In other words, you want a world that is amenable to American interests and values without the United States having to constantly threaten and use military force or deploy military power. Now, when I look at the world, there's a question. I don't see the hegemony. I see in many cases what I would call a foreign policy bubble that is in the process of deflating in various stages. Now, if we begin with perhaps what has traditionally been the most important place in the world for the United States, and that's Europe, the Eurasian continent, of which much of we fought 2 live wars and the Cold War about, I see that the United States is actually less influential today than it has been for any period in the last 50 years. It has in effect ceded primacy, and I think rightfully so, to the European Union in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe. The U.S. is at the point now where even if the Europeans don't fully realize that the United States needs Europe, particularly European bases, much more than Europe needs an American protection, since Europe faces few, if any, real live military threats. Now, this was driven home to me by a recent visit of 2 Polish gentlemen from one of the leading government think tanks there. And they were coming to the United States in part as their ritual to, because of the emotional attachment to the United States, but also in the belief that the United States is the most important power and player in the world. So I asked them, what are the 3 most important national security or foreign policy problems that Poland has to deal with in the next decade? And they listed a favorable accession agreement with the European Union, promoting stability in Ukraine, and preventing as much spillover of instability in the Balkans and the Middle East as possible to avoid any disruption of the first 2. Now, of course, the United States has very little to do and very little influence with the internal accession process in the European Union. It also, surprisingly, now has virtually no influence in terms of stability in Ukraine. American investors have essentially given up on Ukraine. American government is now withdrawing much of the aid and assistance that took place over the last decade. And so it's now Russian capital that is coming up and buying up Ukrainian enterprises, trying to, it's Putin that is calling Kuchman on the carpet for whether there's too much corruption in the Ukrainian system. And it's going to be obviously Bonn and Berlin. Similarly, it's German, French, and British, Italian troops in the Balkans more than American troops and nation building, European money that is preventing the spillover of instability. But yet there's a foreign policy bubble. There's in 3 years, maybe they won't maybe they'll be going to Berlin and Moscow instead of the United States as this reality sets in. We see a similar phenomenon, I think, in East Asia, where, again, I would argue American influence is on the wane, in part because of the emergence of for good reasons, in part because of the emergence of China as a more responsible regional power, no longer threatening its neighbors, wanting to put relations on good neighborly and commercial terms, and partly because of the legacy of America's role in the Asian financial crisis. And it's partly because of this legacy of the U.S. pushing financial liberalization that has now cost the United States considerable influence in that part of the world. In fact, some of its closest allies, South Korea among it, has essentially been defying the United States for the last 3 or 4 years, essentially pursuing old-fashioned Keynesian strategies, partly because the American market is not what it used to be, in part because it realizes it needs to develop much more of its own internal market. Now, the part of the problem, of course, is that Japan is weak, and there is perhaps no alternative in some ways, in the sense to a balance of interest and balance of power in that part of the world. But the U.S. shouldn't take too much, Japan's weakness too lightly, given that Japan holds more than $3 trillion. Japan's weakness too lightly, given that Japan holds more than $3 trillion of U.S.-denominated assets, and either Japan's failure or its success, either scenario could bring down, in a sense, that dollar. Now, Charles has pointed out some of the limits to military supremacy, which I will not go into, other than to saying that we're in a situation where I think the true test of America's ability to accomplish political and national security goals by projecting military power is yet to be proven. It was not, even though the United States could win easily in some ways Afghanistan, that did not deny the Al-Qaeda or Taliban, other failed states, and perhaps Afghanistan sometime in the future, as Anatole alluded to, of a base of operations. And while the United States certainly can obliterate Iraq, so can France, Britain, Russia, Israel, Pakistan, and India. The question is whether the U.S. can engage in a form of urban welfare that will result in the overthrow of Saddam Hussein without arousing the Arab street and the Arab basement, and and creating the basis for a stable, as opposed to another failed state in that part of the room. My second main point I want to make about the emphasis on preeminence of being a false starting point is that there are some areas where indeed America has dominance and preeminence, particularly Latin America and the Middle East. Now, I can't think of two regions that are in a worse mess, in large part because of American preeminence in those two parts of the world. Let's take our own neighborhood. Colombia seems like an interminable civil war, in part because of American drug policy. Venezuela is falling apart because its people prefer to have an incompetent populist in power as opposed to an American-backed neoliberal. Castro may outlive yet another American president. Latin America generally is now turning its back on neoliberalism. It's come to the sober conclusion that America is never going to open up its cotton, soybeans, sugar, textiles, and steel markets, partly because of Southern economics, meaning that those are the very products that are the base of the Bush administration's base. The one bright spot, you might say, is Mexico, and indeed Mexico has made enormous progress towards democracy, until you realize the fact that the standard of living for 80% of Mexicans is lower now than it was 2 decades ago, before it became a close part of the United States outsourced manufacturing sector. Now, the Middle East is even perhaps less. The United States has worked very hard, except for one period over the last 30 years, to maintain its preeminence in the Middle East, to keep out other powers, and even to exclude the United Nations from it. And that period was 1995, when the elder Bush created this international coalition and followed on with the Madrid conference that helped the Europeans and the Norwegians encourage an Oslo process. But if you look at the Middle East, where America has had dominance over the last 2 or 3 decades, the U.S. has become the principal protagonist in an Islamic civil war. Its one of its principal allies, Saudi Arabia, is funding Islamic fundamentalists. Large majorities of its allies, according to public opinion polls, either hate or distrust the United States because of our one-sided support of Israel and because of our seeming unwillingness to either find a way to support democracy and development. Per capita income in the Arab world is lower than it was in the 1980s. Now, the problem I have here about dominance and preeminence is that we've tried it and it's failed. What has worked, on the other hand, is, as Mike Lind has pointed out, in Europe and East Asia is when where America has been, in effect, in a coalition. Now, why has dominance failed? Well, we like to think of the United States as a sort of different kind of hegemonic power, one that uses its power for universal rules and the common good. But in the place where we've had dominance, unfortunately, when we have not had a balance of interest and balance of power, we've had no checks and balances on America's worst tendencies. And particularly the worst tendencies of the United States to be, American foreign policy in those areas to be captured by either special interest groups or crude commercial interest at the expense of creating a larger common good. I mean, the extremist Cuban groups in Florida and Connecticut that have held our strategy towards Cuba in hostage for the last 2 or 3 decades, which I think has prevented us from nudging Castro out of the way, is the most obvious example. Now, there was, as I said, one exception to this tendency of American dominance in the Middle East, and that was the period 1990 and 95, which actually was the most successful period of American policy, because the Bush pair was forced to create an international coalition, and then followed that with an international conference on the Middle East, and allowed the Europeans, in essence, to then take over and provide the necessary mediation to get us to the first stage of the Oslo process. It was only when the Clinton administration then elbowed the Europeans out of the way in 95, 96, and also began to elbow UNSCOM out of the way in 96 and 97 that we began to again fall into some problems. Now, Steve has told me that I have 1 minute left, which I was going to tell you what I think the American grand strategy ought to be, but let me just give you a taste of it. I think the United States faces 3 overwhelming challenges in thinking about the weakness. One is that we face a world where there are notable areas of failed governance and a global shadow economy that gives rise to international criminal behavior, but also allows international terrorism to exist with increasing difficulty of stopping. Now, we've seen how failed states in Afghanistan, to some degree parts of Pakistan, but we may see other failed states in the near future, Indonesia, Pakistan over the longer term, North Korea, etc. And this is a major problem of world order that we face. The second is that we have a dysfunctional Arab world and parts of some Islamic societies that supports and condones hatred and towards the United States, and it will take a generation, decade to begin to change that. The final problem, and perhaps the most serious problem, is as a matter of demographics and a matter of America's own economic problems, the world economy for the first time is without an engine of world economic growth and development. We've seen the failure of neoliberalism. We're now at the point where the United States can no longer serve as the assured market of first and last resort. It competes with capital, with many of the emerging market economies, and moreover, Europe and Japan both for demographic reasons but for structural economic reasons, are also weak. And without an engine for world economic growth and development, I would argue that the problems of world order and the kinds of problems the United States faces are only going to grow more serious, not less so. But there's virtually no discussion of that problem at all.
Thank you, Cheryl. You've all been very patient, and I will get to questions. I have our staff of the New America Foundation will be coming around with microphones. I will ask people to identify themselves and their institution, and I will insist on brevity because there'll be a lot of questions. And as we're getting prepared, I do want to pose one point. Last week I had the opportunity to listen both to John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, one of the leading realist thinkers in the United States, who helped launch an ad in the New York Times some time ago, raising very serious doubts and questions about the Bush Doctrine. The day before, Bill Moyers' son, John Moyers, orchestrated an ad that some of you may have seen on the New York Times op-ed page that had a picture of Osama bin Laden, fashioned like an Uncle Sam ad, saying, "I want you, but not for the Marines, but to invade Iraq," and a bit of text. The bit of text sounded very similar in many ways to the principal questions that John Mearsheimer and the realist school were posing. And then lastly, Joschka Fischer was in town last week. Joschka Fischer was hosted at lunch by the German ambassador among a small school of foreign policy luminaries, almost all of whom served either in the Clinton or the Carter administrations. There was one Republican in the room. Every single one of those foreign policy luminaries, I should say, they all came from the National Security Council staff or the Department of Defense. There was no one from state who had been formerly in state, with the exception of one person who's rather closely associated with Al Gore. Every one of them criticized Joschka Fischer and Germany's position on Iraq, on foreign policy thinking. It sounded as if what I was in the room hearing was a Robert Kagan, Bill Kristol expose and critique of Germany from Democrats. And so what I'd like to pose to any of you who'd like to respond is many of us have dealt with this slightly in terms of a school of thought issue, but also as a partisan issue, like somehow the Clinton administration would do it differently, or another administration would do this differently. And I question that given what I saw last week, and I'm interested in any comments.
Well, if I could respond to that, I think the Democratic Party, I'm always remember Mark Twain's comment. He said, "I belong to no organized political party. I'm a Democrat." There's no Democratic Party. There are 4 or 5 factions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think I've lost the.
Push your button again.
Okay. Minor technical difficulties. The ethnic and regional and ideological divisions within the Democratic Party today are such as to more or less paralyze it on foreign policy. The 2 most loyal group of Democratic voters are Jews and African Americans. Jewish Democrats tend to be very hawkish, and I'm told by Democratic staffers on the Hill that many Jewish Democrats support Ariel Sharon. They don't even support the Labor Party. African Americans tend to be the most opposed to U.S. military intervention abroad of any group in the U.S. population, and this has obvious historical reasons, and it goes way, way back in prior American history. There's a tremendous regional divide between Southern Democrats, Southern white Democrats, and Northern white Democrats, which again has roots in our history. Most of the Democrats who voted with President Bush on the Iraq resolution came from Southern states. Most of the Republicans who opposed that measure came from New England and Midwestern states. So you have this kind of 4 or 5-way split within the Democratic Party. I don't think it represents a consensus. I don't think that all Democrats agree with the neoconservative view, but I think they're paralyzed from offering an alternative.
I'll have to go see where the luncheon guests were from. Any other quick comments?
Sorry.
Anatole?
Very quickly. It's possible that on Iraq, a democratic administration would have taken the same line. I think that on some of the other things I've been talking about, they would have done their best, to mollify international or European opinion in other areas.
Kyoto Protocol.
Yes, and that this therefore would have preserved at least a much better atmosphere.
I see. Let me take some questions now. First, Alton Fry. I know some of you by name, and so of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you, Steve. These very trenchant comments invite at least a question to elicit some tempering of the perspective that's been offered. And my question is the following. Is it possible that by framing the doctrines of preemption and the pursuit of dominance in a strategy document that in fact includes many other elements of different character, an emphasis on the need to cooperate in international development, an emphasis on the need for coalitions to deal with global warming and related threats to the United States as well as to the world, is it possible that the president has in fact given the rhetoric to Paul Wolfowitz, but has framed something that permits the pursuit of the kinds of policy objectives that the panel has described? One notes that beyond the multiple elements in the strategy document, the president did go, perhaps grudgingly, to elicit congressional support for a contingent policy on Iraq. He has invested now substantial time personally in that important address to the United Nations and the Security Council process in seeking a coalition to deal with that particular problem. So in short, is the rhetoric perhaps more worrisome than the real policy?
Well, I take it that's directed to me. My response would be, defeat is not conversion. Neither is retreat. If Bush has to back down from his preferred policy options under public and congressional and international criticism, it seems to me that my critique of the preferred policy options stands, even if in practice it gets watered down or defeated.
Let me ask Charlie Kupchan, who also served on a National Security Council staff, to comment.
I agree with you, Alton, that the document itself is in some respects quite nuanced and broad-based. And the problem from my perspective is not the rhetoric, but the action. And the Bush administration has been behaving in such a way that it magnifies the effects of talk of preemption and talk of preeminence. And so I think the real problem here is the extent to which the U.S. has been alienating much of the rest of the world. And just quickly to respond to Steve's earlier question, it's because it's a very important one, and that is this a passing idiosyncrasy? If Wolfowitz were not there or Bush were not there, would this problem go away? And I think the answer is no. And that's because Bush reflects changes that are taking place in American politics and in geopolitics. The more difficult political landscape in terms of forging a liberal internationalism. So in that sense, I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of trying to conduct the affairs of this country in ways that further rather than undermine a cooperative international order.
Let me ask Lorelei Kelly with the Stimson Center and a joint appointment in the House of Representatives. Lorelei?
Thank you. Thank you for those presentations. That was wonderful. The question I have is regarding the September National Security Strategy from the White House, which, if you exclude the part on preemptive strategy, is just a testament to the benefits of alliances and multilateralism. They even mention peace operations and nation building in part, and increased aid as part of a comprehensive defense and security strategy. Is it completely cynical that it's just something that they're putting out there to appease internationalists and they're not going to do anything to stand up and realize those objectives? Or what are some coalition building strategies we can use, certainly in Congress, to hold their feet to the fire to actually walk their talk?
Let me direct this to Anatole and then other comments.
I mean, I don't think it's entirely cynical. I mean, as I said, it would be a grave mistake to see this administration, as we all know, as monolithic. There are, different factions within it. Unfortunately, there have been a range of high-profile issues that have been mentioned in which they have taken a very unilateralist and I would say nationalist line, and this has affected opinion in the rest of the world. It's created a presumption, if you like, of nationalist guilt, which has discouraged other people. Aspects of this, of course, have life itself, as the Russians used to say, have rolled them back from it. Clearly they came in with a very ideological position, many of them. Or if not ideological, sometimes, as we all know, it was basically just knee-jerk reaction against what Clinton had been doing or what they perceived Clinton to have done. For example, the hostility to nation building now, simply looks completely unviable, irrelevant, whatever other adjectives one could think of in the context of Afghanistan. I mean, without nation building, there is no strategy there. I mean, there's nothing except military occupation, which of course nobody wants either in the long run. So, I mean, I think there is a case that their bark has been worse than their bite. But in international relations, bark and bite are not always distinguishable, in this way. They've barked so much that, it has had a real effect on other people's behavior.
Briefly, Cheryl?
Yeah, I'd refer you back to Anatol's presentation, where he talked about the inability to prioritize American national interests and concerns. And therefore, it's the kind of priority that they've given to Iraq. They could have given priority to a world economic plan for global reflation that worked with the Europeans and Japanese and Chinese, that says the world economy is entering a very difficult stagnating period. They could have continued to give priority to building kinds of intelligence cooperation and other kinds of policing action and nation building that would have perhaps extended the next stage. They could have given priority to some sort of Arab Marshall Plan, but instead they focused on Iraq and rogue states. That creates a dominant logic within an administration. All the other things are virtually on hold or on autopilot. And so you have to take what they're doing and take the dominant logic of what they're doing as their principal starting point for American foreign policy and grand strategy. And it ain't all those other things.
Another great example of this, I'm going to editorialize for a moment, since you and I were both in Germany recently, is the never-ending treatment in the Washington Post of the U.S.-German problem, that a great state on the verge of war doesn't fight the war in Berlin with allies that have been with us a long time, despite the worst behavior that you might see from the Chancellor of Germany in the recent election, because that is something that you can exact punishment from your ally later. But for a great power not to be magnanimous, not to step aside and keep the focus on what the real objective is certainly, I think, falls very well with what Cheryl and I would, just coming back from Germany and also reading Henry Kissinger's sort of rambling op-ed the other day about our, pining for the past and simplicity of U.S.-German relations is extraordinary because it demonstrates how unready we are to maintain a focus and to basically deal with allies in a way where you give them an opportunity to give ourselves the ultimate flexibility in the end. When I asked Richard Pearl about this, Richard Pearl told me, he says, well, it's a deterrence against any other foreign leaders that might try the same thing. But nonetheless, it does really, create a problem of focus. This gentleman right in front of you, Megan. I should know your name, and I apologize.
Radek Sikorski, New Atlantic Initiative at the American Enterprise Institute. I was particularly struck with the mentioning of the two interlocutors that our last panelist had from Poland. As Poland's former Deputy Foreign and Defense Minister, my comments that indeed accession to Europe, stabilizing the Balkans are Poland's concern, but I think they were derelict in their duty because they didn't tell you, maybe because they thought it was obvious, that keeping American troops in Europe was also a major Polish policy objective. Plus, we face a rogue state, Europe's remaining dictatorship in Belarus. And that leads me to what Michael Lind said, that namely, there are plenty of people in Europe who think that reassurance, maintaining American presence, and targeting rogue states are pretty good political objectives. And that also leads me to comment on what Anatol Lieven said, namely, Anatol, you and I know that there are no such people as Europeans. We hear about Europeans in Washington. In Europe, there are representatives of the various countries, and insofar as they are Europeans, multilateralist, peace-loving, sophisticated, and all the things that you seem to be suggesting, they are in the business of constructing a new nationalism, a European nationalism that has an anti-American edge, and which I'm not sure it's in the U.S. interest to encourage.
Thank you.
Well, if I could respond briefly, no one except maybe for isolationists has proposed that the U.S. get out of NATO. Or that the U.S. not have any troops in Europe at all. What I was referring to was the kind of sub rosa conversations, and perhaps they still have this in Poland, saying, well, we have to keep an eye on those Germans. You know, they might come back, or the Russians. Frankly, I don't think it is credible that Germany is going to invade its neighbors ever again, not in the lifetime of anyone here. And I think Russia, Belarus, it seems to me, even if you get rogue states building up their militaries and making threats for various reasons, having an expanded NATO with solidarity among the NATO allies, including the United States, can achieve that purpose. It's not a matter of how many troops are actually there on the ground or not.
Briefly, Cheryl.
Yeah, to defend the honor of your colleagues from Poland, we did in fact speak at great length about the problem of Belarus and came to the conclusion that indeed, again, it would require Russian and European cooperation as much as anything the United States could do to deal with the problem of Yuklashchenko, etc.
Anatol.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Radek, you're completely right. I mean, I shouldn't have suggested that there was that Europeans either were monolithic. One index of that is that Poles are much more interested in very close relations with America than many other Europeans are. I would say that. Oh, yes, and I mean, on the new European nationalism, no, I can't agree with that. I don't think that what the European Union is about is really creating a European nationalism which would have any parallels to any nationalism of the past. French, of course, ideas for Europe are tinged with anti-Americanism. But I think what Americans need to look at very, very carefully is the way in which certain countries, certain populations like the English, which have been traditionally, on balance, not just very pro-American, but even actually quite anti-European, have shifted really quite noticeably if you look at the opinion polls over the course of the past year. That's why I mentioned the tremendous difference today in opinion polls between attitudes to the war in Afghanistan and attitudes to the war in Iraq. And that's not just because of the specific question of the war, you know, the different issue, as I would see it, but as many British people would see it, of the war against al-Qaeda and the war against Iraq. It's also about a whole range of other things that the Bush administration has done over the course of the past year, which have, frankly, just sapped public goodwill in Great Britain.
Thank you. We are making good progress in the questions, and I see all your hands. So don't get frustrated because I see good friends like Nick and Mike and others that are you know, furious right now. But I promise we'll work through the room. But I have Irv Chapman next.
Thank you. To Professor Kupchin, you suggested that if America gets too strong, a countervailing force will arise somewhere. The Europeans have been reluctant to spend money on defense, and they evaded any original participation in the Balkans. So who except China could be such a countervailing force? And I'd also like to ask others, to what extent is the disdain for the United States among allies directed personally at George W. Bush, and not for the first time, because the U.S. has a tendency to elect presidents from provisional governors who have no foreign policy experience. But George Bush, is he seen as a Texas tough-talking cowboy in over his head?
Let me ask Charlie first and then Mike to sell the Texas book.
By countervailing force, I do not suggest that there will be an alternative pole out there with a military capability that could stand up to the United States. But I do think that what we are seeing is balancing taking place in more subtle forms. That is, countries locking arms to resist American power in the UN Security Council, in other international fora. And in that sense, it is a countervailing political force, a counterpoise to the United States, even though not a military challenger. And I think the next challenger to the United States is not China or the Islamic world, it's the EU. It's a collective Europe. And I think it's already happening before our eyes. We don't see it because we think of Europe as our kissing cousins, and that we could never part ways with them. But I think the West, if you will, is coming apart into a North American and a European variant. I happen to believe that America's days as a strategic protector of Europe are numbered, and that even though NATO is enlarging later this year at Prague Summit, it's going to be a hollow enlargement, because I think what will happen is the Bulgarians and the Romanians and the Balts will come and they'll show up to the party with their best black tie on, and there'll be no one there except a few people because NATO is losing its guts, its core. And that's because America's strategic priorities are shifting. They're shifting geographically to the Middle East and to East Asia, and they're shifting functionally to terrorism and failed states. So in that sense, I think we are really in the midst of a profound geopolitical change in which Europe will be, of necessity, taking more care of itself, gradually spending more on defense, but in so doing, emerge as a more capable, self-assertive counterweight to the United States. And I don't think we're going to like it one bit.
Mike, on George Bush?
Oh, I think on the question of European perceptions of George W. Bush, I should defer to Anatole Lieven.
They're not too positive on the whole. I think including they're more positive, of course, in England in the Conservative Party than almost anywhere else in Europe. But then, of course, the Conservative Party has had not just its trousers, but practically its underclothes stolen by New Labour in recent years. It has been reduced to something of a rump, which certainly cannot be called characteristic more widely. Of course, in Italy, an interesting case. I mean, Berlusconi has obviously a great admiration for the kind of spirit represented by George Bush.
Cowboy capitalism.
Well, yes, absolutely. But then Berlusconi finds himself, to some degree, pretty ostracized and looked down on within Europe. So I would say there is a cultural problem there, which of course is not new in terms of European American relations, and it was certainly very evident under Reagan. But of course, in Reagan's day, we must never forget, in Reagan's day, you had Soviet tank armies in East Germany to hold us all together. You don't have that now, and it's very questionable whether terrorism, Al-Qaeda, threats from the Middle East can really play that role of holding America and Europe together, since, of course, one of the key issues on which so many Europeans disagree profoundly with the US is precisely policy towards Israel and the Middle East peace process.
Anatole, let me push you a little bit more on that question. There are many institutions that are right now going through lots of strife in terms of debates among their key people over these issues. Your colleague at the Carnegie Endowment, Robert Kagan, lives in Brussels. And when I was recently in Europe, the Europeans told me we don't have people who think like Robert Kagan in Europe, anywhere within the political spectrum, that the neoconservatives as a group don't exist, even in the most conservative elements. What do you think is that true? But what do you think the consequence is that the dominant strain of thinking in the White House isn't represented within the political spectrum of Europe?
I think it is true, and I mean that brings me back to something that Radek said, but also following on from something I said in my talk, which is about the nature of nationalism. Now, there are very ugly and pretty strong nationalisms in Europe, but they are, at their ugliest fringe, they are, if you like, skinhead nationalisms, and they are profoundly defensive. Not necessarily in a good sense, on the contrary. They are resentful, exclusionary, anti-immigrant, very much about erecting higher and higher walls around Europe. They're in many ways hostile even to labour movement, my God, from Poland, let alone from elsewhere. But your German who thinks in these terms, for example, doesn't think at all, really, in terms of a projection of German or European military force into the wider world. He's not dreaming of going off to die in a trench, even in Königsberg, let alone in the Middle East. And so, one of the things that I think strikes Europeans very much about people like Kagan is that, as I've said, there is a certain air of old style European nationalism. In fact, for Germans, of course, and please don't think for a second I'm talking about the Nazis here, but there is a certain air of some old-style German geopolitical thinking and realist thinking, which, yes, really doesn't find a home anywhere in Europe, except to some extent in Britain. Partly because, or perhaps I should say in England, because there is quite a difference here between English attitudes and Scottish and Welsh ones. But I think that is partly because of this feeling of very great closeness to America. In Britain, the identification with what one British diplomat recently said to me was Anglo-Saxon values, back to the days of Churchill and Conan Doyle, is very strong. Also, there is this imperial nostalgia in Britain, which does, incline people more towards, thoughts of the projection of power, of a role in the wider world. But frankly, it's also because simply Britain didn't have quite as much of the stuffing knocked out of it, either in the wars of the 20th century or in the decolonization process, as other countries did. Britain didn't go through the French experience in Indochina or Algeria. We've been able to persuade ourselves that we decolonized in a very gentle, very responsible, very humane and civilized way, which is at least 50% complete rubbish, of course, but anyway.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to couple a few questions here now because there are a lot of people. Let me get Nick Berry.
Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. Isn't it remarkable that the name Colin Powell has not been cited very much?
12 minutes left, Nick.
Yes, Mr. Levin said that the Bush administration is not monolithic. And the role of Colin Powell is seen rather widely internationally as a brake on the neoconservative runaway train. And foreign governments rather unanimously support Colin Powell. Doesn't this mean in the long run, with that support, that Colin Powell will emerge victorious on issues like North Korea, Iraq, and the Middle East?
Thank you. And I'm going to collect a few questions. In the very back, if you'll identify yourself, please.
Thank you. I'm John Utley. I write for antiwar.com. We have another site, againstbombing.com. And a question to the panel. What about the religious right? The leadership, Senator Inhofe, says God gave the land to Israel. The president himself, there's some articles we run, his terminology of evil, the way he talks about it, is very much in the same genre as Falwell and Robertson. What about this whole element that runs the Republican foreign policy, if you will, which is the Armageddonites, we call them, or if you look on the web, Armageddon Lobby, you'll come to information on this, that Israel is fulfilling Israel and America are doing God's work to help bring about the end of the world.
Thank you. Mike Miyazawa.
Mike Miyazawa, Marubeni. I cannot tell what American grand strategy will be or should be because I'm not an American, I'm Japanese. But instead I can share with you some of the thoughts that I've gathered from my friends, mainly from Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. They are ordinary businessmen and they are ordinary diplomats. None of them are so-called experts on strategy of security issues. Most of them have told me that at least there are three elements to be included in the so-called Bush doctrine. A, America is always just and right, and whoever disagrees with America is always evil and wrong. B, ends justify means. C, might is right. Having said that, my question is, several days after 9/11 attacks last year, President Bush came to the Congress and made a major speech about the war on terrorism. In that speech, he asked, why do they hate us? And he replied by himself, because we are free. Is this the real answer to the question? Has he addressed the root causes of why there are some people in some parts of the world who hate America?
Thanks, Mike. And Mark Chavan.
Marcia van NRC Handelsblad, the Netherlands. Having listened carefully to all your exciting analyses, and for this question, Mike Lynn's explanation why the Democrats aren't able to come up with a foreign policy statement, I still wonder, how did it come about that Wolfowitz and the neocons came out winning? What happened since '92? What happened to the foreign policy establishment?
Let me get this last question right here.
Jay Tolson, U.S. News and World Report. I think this question has sort of been asked indirectly, but I'd like to direct it again. And that is, sort of taking up for the last questioner, how did this happen? Is the preeminence given to preemption, or I think a better word, prevention, really all about the Middle East and our particular course of action that we're trying to take in the Middle East? And particularly, is it the triumph of the view that the Middle Eastern problem has to be addressed through a military resolution of the Palestinian-Israel conflict? Is Iraq all about, among other things, the Bekaa Valley and Hezbollah and what must be done there? Is it, at the same time, convenient that we're not pursuing as aggressively other aspects, including the war of ideas, the central role of Saudi Arabia as the source of Wahhabi ideology, and perhaps a great deal of funding? I'd like you to address that, because I think that also brings up the question of how lasting this preeminence of preemption will be.
Thank you, Jay. I think you all have an impossible task to respond to these excellent questions, but I expect that you will achieve that goal. Let me start with first Michael Lind to respond, and then we'll work through.
Well, I'd like to respond to just a couple of the questions. As for the idea that we were attacked because they hate us because we're free, we've been free since 1782. And Arab and Muslim terrorists began attacking us only after we emerged as a great military power in their neighborhoods. So that has something to do with it. It's not merely American liberalism, although that's not to underestimate the deep clash of civilizations between us and crusading theocratic despotic types like Osama bin Laden. How could Wolfowitz, the gentleman from the Netherlands, how could the Wolfowitz faction prevail? I think there are two answers. George W. Bush, as I argue in my book Made in Texas, which is forthcoming, unlike me, he's not a native of Texas, but he was raised in Texas. He's a genuine cultural Texan, and it's a very militaristic frontier society with southern traditions of machismo. So I think that unlike his father, and like the southern base of the present-day American Republican Party, the kind of things the neocons were telling him back when he was running for president really sort of struck a chord with him culturally as much as personally that it didn't with his father. So I think that's part of, that explains before 9/11. After 9/11, I think, that's when power decisively shifted from the Powell faction to the Wolfowitz faction within the administration for obvious reasons. There was this desire to strike back, this bloodlust and hysteria. Related to this, the point the gentleman raised about the religious right. I've read George Bush's campaign biography, which is very revealing. It's not like most campaign biographies, which try to be inoffensive. He talks at great length about becoming a born-again Christian and being converted by Billy Graham and visiting the land where Jesus walked and all of this stuff. He has said in public he doesn't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. He's a creationist. I think he's a fundamentalist. Even though he's nominally a Methodist, I think that he is a member of the religious right. I think, I can't prove this, I think George Bush believes that God gave Abraham and his descendants Judea and Samaria, as well as the existing territory of Israel. Abraham is descendants for perpetuity. I can't prove this, but from his entire career and from his own writings, it would suggest that this is the case. Finally, Jay Tolson, the business about prevention. I followed Wolfowitz and his neoconservative allies since I was one of them back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. When I first came to Washington in the 1980s, the neoconservatives were denouncing the Reagan administration for being soft because it did not applaud Israel's attack on Iraq's Osiris nuclear reactor on June 7th, 1981. The Reagan administration condemned this act of preventive war. UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, reluctantly, I think, condemned it in the United Nations. Margaret Thatcher said, armed attack in such circumstances cannot be justified. It represents a grave breach of international law. Nevertheless, from that time forward, among neoconservatives in Washington and New York and other American centers, the Osiris raid was held up as an example of superlative statesmanship that the United States, if it weren't so wimpy and hobbled by legal considerations, should follow. So I think you have to understand that the preventive war, you're quite right. This is what I'm saying is that this originates from the Middle East. But I think it's a conscious emulation by the neoconservatives of the tactics that Israel has used in fighting against its enemies in the 90s and 80s, justifiably perhaps. But I think that this is Israeli influence on American foreign policy.
Cheryl?
Yeah. On the question of why Wolfowitz, the triumph of Wolfowitz, I think you have to look that the Democrat liberal triumphalists laid a very fertile ground for Wolfowitz, and I think there's a lot of similarities in positions between what I would regard as the Madeleine Albright wing of the Democratic foreign policy team and the Wolfowitz view. And so I see more continuity between Clinton and Bush on these issues, leaving aside the points that Mike Lynn just made. And in that context, the European irritation with the United States is not new either. I remember the response of the Europeans after the Denver G8 summit, which was outrage at the arrogance of Rubin and Summers. Summers, I guess, had just taken over, and Crowd, in the sense of the three principles the Japanese colleagues cited, seemed to be at work in the area of international financial matters, and indeed, 97, 98 represented then the overreaching of the sort of American preeminence in the international financial system, in the sense that the kinds of ideas that were pushed by the U.S. proved to be unworkable and create very disastrous results in many parts of the world, whether it was Argentina, Korea, Thailand, or whatever. And so you had the first bursting of the triumphalist bubble. September 11th, however, the triumphalists still had a certain momentum. What happened with September 11th then was the fusion of triumphalism with what I call the politics of paranoia, which is the other side of the neoconservative and Bush coalition, meaning the United States, and why there's a further, I think, sentiment with Israel. In other words, the United States at that point became not only the believer in its own right in terms of this liberal order that it was trying to push, but also became the world's greatest victim. And as the world's greatest victim with the most power in the world, it felt both the right and the opportunity to then strike out and remake the world. So the fusion of the politics of liberal triumphalism with the politics of national security paranoia that September 11th helped trigger has given us, I think, a momentary consensus between the Democrats and Republicans around the current strategy, or at least a strategy that most Democrats will only nitpick about but won't challenge in any fundamental ways. Now, my belief is that the second part of the American foreign policy bubble will burst when we have a comparable failure in the extent to which the arrogance in the national security level will produce counterproductive results or won't produce the kind of results that we're looking for. And if I could just say one more word in summary, that's why I think American grand strategy actually ought to be about encouraging the development of responsible centers of power and authority with which the United States can more closely work, much in a great power concert, which is quite different than dominance and preeminence.
Anatol?
Yes, well, I would agree with all of that. I'd just add, what has also been mentioned, the fact that the perception, at least, of overwhelming American military supremacy does constitute a very grave temptation in itself to head in the direction of the kind of, doctrine developed by Wolfowitz, because clearly, I mean, since the end of the Soviet Union, there has been no superpower competitor. And some of the attempts to portray China, for example, as something that's going to emerge very quickly as a competitor have involved, in my view, very considerable exaggerations. There is one other factor, which is, what one can only call, unfortunately, the very extensive indifference of the American public to international affairs, to security affairs, certainly when it comes to the details thereof. And that, of course, has always given activist minorities, if you will, a remarkable capacity to drive their agendas forward. It's always the way, if you have an apathetic mass and a few people who really know what they want, they're likely to get their way. Now, that's especially true, of course, in the atmosphere since 9/11, which Shirl has mentioned, in which clearly the whole atmosphere when it comes to the treatment of external affairs has been heated up. But to an absolutely extraordinary extent, this has not led actually to more focus on international affairs on the part of, people here. If one listens to people in the papers, in the television stations, it's easy to blame the bosses for not keeping to their promises of more serious news, but they are responding to focus groups, they are responding to opinion polls. Yes, I mean, it has led certain groups really to be able to push their agendas, and of course in the context of the war against terrorism, that is preeminently true of the Israeli lobby. And I think, it's a very important point that you raised, Jay, which is that, if the administration, if any American administration were really concentrated first and foremost on the war against Al-Qaeda and its allies and its funders and recruiters, this would produce, not a completely different strategy, of course, but a really pretty significantly different strategy, and it would indeed lead to much more targeting of Saudi Arabia would be seen as a more urgent target, in whatever sense one wants to use the word target, than Iraq would. Yeah.
Thank you. Charles, final word.
I think that many Americans, including those of us in this room, are very familiar with U.S. foreign policy grand strategy during the Cold War and not very familiar with what came before. Because up to 1941, the U.S. practiced a very contingent, tough-minded, stubborn foreign policy, equal parts unilateral and isolationist. And it took Roosevelt an enormous effort with the backdrop of World War II to get us to some internationalist, moderate, liberal center, which then carried through the next 5 decades, largely because we had the Soviet Union out there to keep us in that moderate, liberal center. And I think part of what's happened is that without the Soviet Union around, the sources of liberal internationalism in the United States are much harder to come by. And we are therefore moving back towards a more contingent and contentious internationalism, more similar to pre-1941 America than post-1941 America. And a lot of people said, well, terrorism, it's the new Pearl Harbor, it's going to push us back to the center. I think exactly the opposite. It's reinforcing the extremes, that is, a unilateralist anger, vulnerability, paranoia on the one hand, and I think it will come back, a neo-isolationist tendency which says, let's put up the barriers, let's pull in our horns. We don't need to take these hits, and if we don't mess around in other people's hair, they won't mess around in ours. I also agree with the comments of Mike and Anatol and others that part of the problem here is that there are a few issues that get political traction in this country on foreign policy, and they tend to be extremist issues. You don't get votes in this country by saying, I support the UN, I support liberal internationalism. You do get votes in this country by bashing on the UN, by being unilateralist, by talking about the black helicopters. There's a captive audience for that, and the problem is that in the political spectrum, when the rest of us are watching The Simpsons, there are a few people pounding the drums on some of these issues, and they therefore have a magnified voice. One final point. And part of the problem that we're seeing here is a reversal of the common internationalism, common view of American national identity that was a product of the industrial age. And that's because the digital economy is to some extent reversing the industrial melting pot, and our country is becoming more culturally segmented, more socioeconomically segmented. And in that sense, again, to use a historical analogy, I think we're going to be back in a world like we were in the 19th century, where regional, sectional, ethnic, cultural divides have an important role in shaping our foreign policy, and I think a hampering role. And that's why I think we're not just at a little idiosyncratic blip of the Bush administration, but the beginning of a new era in which we're all going to have to work hard to push this country back towards some moderate, liberal internationalism.
I think Mike Lind made a pop culture reference. I'm going to, too, in closing, and also in thanking our speakers, that the United States for some time, as Charlie and Mike and Cheryl and Anatole have shown, has been part of a thug management system, if you look at that. We've had thugs in the world. We've had a lot of them. We've managed them well. The question that we're debating today is whether that thug management system needs to be substantially changed. We also have a qualitative difference in the kind of thugs we're looking at today. You have Osama bin Laden, who looks like he comes out of a looks a lot like Dr. Evil or a James Bond character who's beyond state. He could be in a cave in the ocean somewhere on a satellite, versus a Saddam Hussein, who has a lot of characteristics of the kind of person you might see in a John le Carré novel or something, a thug we've known and handled and managed in the past. And I think essentially it's that debate, and also it's the blurring, in my concern, is the blurring of the kind of threats to the West or to the United States and U.S. interests, which I think is of great concern. We are very pleased to have sponsored and organized today's program with the World Policy Institute. I want to thank Steve Schlesinger. I want to thank all of our panelists, Charlie Kupchan, Michael Lind, Anatole Levin, Cheryl Schweninger, for joining us today. I also want to thank our staff, particularly Megan Kiesel, Max, Troy, John, and Hanan, for joining us, because this couldn't occur on very short notice. And thank you all very much for joining us, and thanks to C-SPAN for joining us today. Thank you.